let me ask you a question. Have you ever finished a coaching conversation feeling like you did everything right? The client had meaningful goals, they genuinely wanted change. You asked thoughtful questions, the conversation felt productive, and yet a week later, they're in the exact same place. I know personally, as coaches, when we experience these moments, they can be frustrating. We can wonder whether we missed something, whether we should have asked a different question or challenged them more, maybe even listen differently. But what if the most important part of the coaching conversation wasn't something that you missed? What if it was something that you couldn't see? Hey, y'all, I am Dr. Andréa Michel. I'm a developmental psychologist, an ACC credential coach, and I am the founder and principal consultant at the Global Center for Trauma Education and Training. And over the years, I've come to realize that developmental psychology changed far more than what I know. It changed how I see people. And it taught me something that now shapes every coaching conversation that I have. People are far more, or people make far more sense when we understand the context in which they develop. Right? That simple idea eventually became one of the guiding principles behind the organizational trauma framework, which is a framework that I developed to explore how significant experiences can shape people, organizations, and the interaction between them. And at the heart of the framework is an observation. And that observation is that no one develops in isolation. We develop within families, within schools, communities, workplace, cultures, and through those experiences that expands us, we're expanded, and sometimes those experiences overwhelm us, right? And those experiences shape how we understand ourselves, how we relate to others, how we respond to challenges, and how we make meaning of the world around us. At the same time, we shape the very systems that we move through our decisions, leadership, communication, and our relationship. And as coaches, we have the privilege of meeting people right at that intersection, right? Our clients don't show up for our sessions with goals alone, do they? No, they arrive with a lifetime of development. Now, I want to be clear about where we're headed today. This session isn't about identifying trauma, it's not about analyzing childhood experiences, and it's certainly not about training coaches or turning coaches into therapists, right? That's not what we do. We refer out. Instead, I want to offer you a different lens, one that is grounded in developmental psychology and formed by the thinking behind the organizational trauma framework. It's a lens that I believe invites us to pause before we interpret behavior and to become curious about um, specifically curious before we reach conclusions, and to recognize that what we see in front of us is only part of the story. Because if there's one idea that I hope stays with you after today, it's this: people make far more sense when we understand the context in which they're developed, right? And perhaps the most powerful question that we can carry into our next coaching conversation is this: what context might I not yet understand, right? So, one of the greatest gifts that developmental psychology has given me is not more knowledge, but it is a different way of seeing people. And as coaches, naturally we pay attention to where our clients are today, right? Because we want to move them forward. We want to know what's the goal, what's getting in the way, what's the next steps, how do we get them from point A to point B, right? And those are definitely and most certainly important questions. But developmental psychology invited me to ask a different question. And that is, how did this person become who they are today? How did they become who they are today? Right? Not because I'm trying to analyze the past, and definitely not because I want to look at their childhood and see what experiences shaped their childhood, but because I understand fundamentally that none of us arrive at any moment in our lives by accident, right? Every one of us is shaped by the environment we've moved through, the relationship we've experienced, the opportunities we've had, the barriers that we've encountered, the things that we've had to overcome, the messages that we've received about ourselves along the way, right? But that's development. And once you begin to see people through that lens, something happens. I think that behavior starts to make more sense. And one idea that I return to a lot is this one. And that's that behavior is often the final chapter of a story that we haven't even read yet. It's the final chapter of the story that we haven't read yet. And as coaches, we usually meet people somewhere in the middle of their story. So we see behaviors, today's goals, today's challenges, but we weren't there for the chapters that came before, right? The chapters that taught someone whether it was safe to speak up, whether asking for help was welcome or even punished, whether mistakes were opportunities to learn or reasons to feel ashamed, whether success was celebrated or whether it was expected, right? Those chapters matter. They matter because behavior doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It develops, it adapts, it serves a purpose. All behavior serves a function, even when that purpose or that function is no longer obvious, right? Think about some of the behaviors that we encounter in coaching. We see procrastination, perfectionism. I'm guilty of being a perfectionist myself, but that's neither here nor there. We see people pleasing, avoiding conflict. Some people have a reluctance to delegate. They have difficulty trusting others, and we can certainly describe those behaviors all day long, no doubt. But description isn't the same as understanding, right? Developmental psychology taught me to pause before assigning meaning. So instead of asking, you know, why is this client doing this or what's wrong with them, I find myself asking again, what context might help this behavior make sense? And I want you to notice that that question itself doesn't assume trauma, it doesn't assume personality dysfunction, it doesn't assume mindset, but it creates room for curiosity. And in my experience, curiosity is almost always a better place to begin than interpretation. Think about that. So, what do I mean by context? Context is the collection of experiences, relationship, environments, and the identities that shape how people develop over time. Right? Trauma can most certainly be part of that context, and sometimes it is. You know, um, you know, the thing is when most people hear the word trauma, they immediately think of catastrophe, right? They think of abuse and violence and war, or even, natural disasters. And those experiences can absolutely 100% be traumatic. But from a developmental perspective, trauma isn't just defined by what happened, right? It's also influenced by whether an experience overwhelmed a person's ability to cope, and whether they had the support or resources that they needed afterwards. So trauma isn't necessarily about what happened, but it is about how did the people around you respond to the event that happened, and what resources were available to you afterwards. And so what that means is that two people can experience the same event, right? And develop very different responses to that event. And our role as coaches is not to determine whether someone has experienced trauma. We should not do that, and we should not diagnose an experience as traumatic. Our role, though, is to recognize that trauma may be one of the many experiences that's influencing how a client thinks, how they respond, how they make decisions, and how they make meaning of their lives, right? So trauma is only one part of the story. But identity matters too, right? Every client enters the coaching relationship with multiple identities. Some of those are immediately visible, right? But some of them are not. Race is not always identifiable. Gender, age, faith, socioeconomic background, disability, professional identity, family roles, those things aren't always visible. And but each of those identities shape how people move through the world, right? And so it reflects, it shapes the opportunities that people have been given. It shapes the barriers that they faced, right? The expectations that are placed upon them, the story that they've learned to believe about themselves. All of those experiences become part of the context that they bring into every coaching conversation. And then there are the systems that people move through every day, right? Families, that's a system. Schools, organizations, workplaces, communities. And you know, one of the ideas at the heart of the organizational trauma framework is that people and systems are constantly shaping one another, right? Organizations influence people. People influence organizations, right? Think about the workplace, right? The same person may thrive under one leader and struggle under another. Ask yourself, think about this. Has that person changed? Probably not. But the environment changed, right? The expectations changed, the relationships changed, the level of trust may have changed, and the psychological safety may have changed. So the interaction between the individual and the system has changed. And as coaches, we have, I believe we have the unique privilege of standing right at the intersection, right? Not to explain our clients, right? Not to diagnose our clients, but to remain curious long enough to understand them more fully. Because the truth is, human behavior is rarely explained by just one thing. And it's important for us to remember and to keep in mind that not every behavior is the result of trauma, right? Not every behavior is a personality defect, right? Not every behavior is the result of trauma or culture. And not every behavior is a mindset thing, especially in the coaching space. We often think it's a mindset thing, but not every behavior is mindset, because what I've learned is that human behavior is complex because human development is complex, right? And when we resist the temptation to oversimplify, what we do is we create the space for deeper conversations, richer insights, and more meaningful coaching. Does that make sense? So, what does this actually change for us as coaches? Interestingly enough, our role doesn't change, but our perspective does, right? We're still partnering with our clients. We're still trusting that they're naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. And we're still focused on their agenda, not our own. But what changes is the lens through which we listen, right? When we begin to think developmentally, we become a little slower to interpret behavior and a little quicker to become curious, right? So instead of trying to explain what we're observing, we begin to explore it with our client. And truthfully, that shift, it may seem subtle, but it can completely change the conversation, right? Um, a client who avoids conflict may not necessarily dislike difficult conversations, and a client who struggles to delegate may simply need stronger leadership skills, right? A client who hesitates before speaking in meetings um, may just lack confidence. Maybe, maybe not. The point isn't to replace one explanation with another, right? The point is to resist the temptation to settle on an explanation too quickly, right? Because once we've decided what a behavior means, then our curiosity stops, right? And coaching is at its best when curiosity stays alive, right? That's why one of the questions I carry into almost every coaching conversation is this: what context, right? What context might help this behavior make sense? And sometimes the answer has to do with trauma, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's organizational culture, sometimes it's a significant life transition. Sometimes it's identity, it's a previous success, it's repeated failure. Sometimes it's a story that the client has been telling themselves for years. And sometimes neither the client nor I may know the answer yet. And guess what? That is okay, right? Because coaching is not about having explanation, right? It's about creating the kind of conversation where new understanding can emerge, right? I've also learned something else, and that is when we become curious about the experiences that have shaped people, I find that we discover something we might have missed if we focused only on the challenge. You know what happens when we do that? We discover strengths. We 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 discover a client who learned to adapt quickly. We have we see a client that becomes remarkably resourceful. a client who has developed deep empathy, a client who persisted when others might have given up, right? Development doesn't only shape our struggles, it also shapes our strengths. And one of the greatest privileges of coaching is helping our clients recognize both, right? And that doesn't mean we step outside of the boundaries of coaching, right? In fact, I think understanding trauma, identity, and context helps us to stay more firmly within those boundaries, right? Because we're not therapists, we're not responsible for assessing or treating trauma. If a client shares something that requires additional clinical support, right, our responsibility is to respond ethically and make the appropriate referral. Refer, right? Understanding context doesn't expand the scope of coaching, right? But it deepens the quality of our presence within it, right? Ultimately, I don't think developmental psychology makes us better because it gives us more answers, but I think it makes us better because it reminds us to ask um, better questions, right? Questions that invite reflection instead of assumption, questions that honor complexity instead of reducing it, and then questions that help people understand themselves a little bit better. And sometimes that's where meaningful change can begin. So I would like to leave you with one final thought, and that is every coaching conversation is an opportunity to meet another human being where they're at any particular moment in their development, right? One decision, one challenge, one goal. But behind that moment is a lifetime of experiences that have shaped how they see themselves, how they relate to others, and how they respond to change. And we may never know every part of the story. And the truth is, we don't need to. But what we need is the humility to recognize that behavior rarely tells the whole story, right? We have to pause before we interpret and to remain curious just a little bit longer so that we can create a coaching relationship where people feel safe enough to explore their own thinking and discover new possibilities for themselves, right? So the next time you find yourself forming an interpretation about um, a client's behavior, pause, take one more breath, and ask yourself, what context might I not yet understand? Because people make far more sense when we understand the context in which they develop. So I am looking forward to continuing this conversation with you during our live session. Together, I think we can and we will move beyond the ideas that we've explored today, and into real coaching conversations. We'll work through some scenarios, reflect on some assumptions that we make as coaches, and we'll explore how a developmental lens can influence the questions that we ask, the partnerships we build, and the presence that we bring to our clients. But most importantly, we'll learn from one another. I look forward to continuing this conversation with you. Thank you so much for your time.